Hello and welcome to another online learning series with Region 8 Education Service Center, and we're pleased to continue our series with around our makerspace and blended learning. Today we're going to be interacting and hearing from Chris Riley, part of our makerspace team. Our makerspace team has been a fantastic resource here from Region 8, and we are really excited to be supported by the Schwab Foundation, a longtime funder of this initiative, and are grateful for their work in helping us push out this information and these resources to educators across Northeast Indiana and beyond. Also joining us today, helping co-facilitate this conversation from our makerspace team is Mike Gorman, and also want to welcome to our presentation today Jane Gorman and Laura Smith. Thank you all for joining us today. Chris, today we're going to be hearing from you on sketchnoting, and this is a week one, part one, so there's multiple parts to this that we'll be recording and hearing from you on. Welcome, thank you for joining us today and your work on this. Can't wait to hear more about sketchnoting and how can this be implemented to help educators in their classroom and blended learning environments. Welcome, Chris. Tell us more about sketchnoting.
Thank you, and I'm so glad that you're here today and that we have you joining us. In thinking about our makerspace, we're mindful of giving you a variety of tools that you can use with your students. And so sketchnoting is one of those things that not only works for makerspace and STEM, but can cross curricula and content and grade level areas. So this week one, part one, we're doing it kind of workshop style. So we'll be stopping and thinking and pausing in both week one and week two. So today is an introduction, and then next time will be more of a deep dive. So here we go with thinking about this tool, and we're actually going to first go in and think about some goals. So I work a lot with teachers in this capacity and others that I'm involved in. And so I ask them, what is it you want for your students? What is it that you need for them for learning and growth? And look at this as just part of the list. And I think that most all of you would agree with things that you're seeing here, that you want students actively engaged in learning. You want them to own it. You want some voice and choice. You want them asking questions and seeking answers and delving into that process. You want them to learn some academic and social skills. You want them to be metacognitive. You want them to want to come to school, or in the case that we're in now, some kids are going to be doing some digital learning and online. So you want them to be invested in that. You want your students to be innovative and be thinking about how to create and use those 21st century skills of critical thinking and creativity. We want our students to develop in a classroom that is developmentally appropriate for them and compatible. And the neat thing about sketchnoting, it is a K-12 way to think. So I'm excited for us to move on because we're going to start with a doodle. So I want to pause for about 15 seconds and have you take a look at this doodle and see if you can come up with what you think it is in your own thoughts. So here we go, 15 seconds. What is this? Well, when I've done this live, I get all kinds of answers. But what it is Thomas Jefferson's macaroni and cheese pasta making machine. That he actually made one. It didn't look like that. But when he was in Paris, he loved macaroni and cheese and became quite enamored with it and wanted to be able to make macaroni. And he actually figured it out and served it at the White House, I believe, in 1802. So that doodle led to an invention. We know he not only was president, but he was quite an inventor. So here's another doodle. Do we recognize that one? That's actually Steamboat Willie by Walt Disney, and that was the precursor to Mickey Mouse. This doodle with some writing attached to it is Theodore Roosevelt. He had a couple of very ornery boys and a daughter named Ethel. So he would write her letters and create doodles, and here Ethel's trying to corral her brothers and get them to be behaving themselves. So when I was teaching way back, when I first started, I would see kids doodling and I would stop that. You need to be paying attention, and I would admonish them, stop doing that. Little did I know then what I came to know, and that's that doodling was actually engaging their brain and was actually putting things down on paper that would help them with memory. Sunny Brown is one of our doodling gurus. She actually has a book called The Doodling Revolution, And she goes into the brain work in her YouTube video. You can find this easily online, and we'll have it on a reference sheet. But what she walks us through is how doodling activates the brain and allows processing to happen and critical thinking. And this means that students and people doodling are synthesizing and making connections. Synthesizing is one of those higher level critical thinking skills, and the brain seeks connections. And when it does that, it puts our work and our thinking into, at the least, working memory and often long-term memory. And that's critical work that we want our students to be doing. And here's one of our ultimate doodlers, Leonardo da Vinci, where he doodled and labeled what he was doing as he created and thought through inventions that he hoped to put into action. And I've actually been to the Leonardo da Vinci Museum in Italy, and it's just amazing how these doodles came to be into real life things. So we start to think, what is sketchnoting exactly? Well, sketchnoting is doodling with purpose, and there's some examples right there of what they can look like. So in sketchnoting, we see examples of sketchnotes all around us as advertisements, in articles, and on social media. No white space is safe when a sketchnoter finds a pen and gets to work. Thinking begins to appear much like invisible ink under an ultraviolet light. And that's from Tanny McGregor's book, Ink and Ideas, Sketchnotes for Engagement, Comprehension, and Thinking. And you'll see over the next couple of weeks, I refer to her quite a bit. And her book is one of our resources that we use a lot to think about sketchnoting. And the neat thing about that particular text is it not only gets us into sketchnoting, but it works with sketchnoting in a variety of content areas. So let's delve even deeper into why would I do sketchnoting? Well, we had a teacher in one of our workshops, and she taught, I believe, 8th grade. And she was really struggling in her science classes to get kids to retain information. So after we worked with sketchnoting like we're doing today, she went back basically the next day and started teaching her students how to sketchnote, and it became part of their repertoire of working with information. What she was very excited about was they sketchnoted their notes, and what she found was on the next test, their scores went up substantially. In fact, students who were at risk and usually failing tests were coming up into that CMB range. And so she was thrilled with just that time she took to teach sketchnoting, practice sketchnoting, and then put it into action in her classroom, brought some significant results. And so that's the why. We want students to be actively engaged, owning their learning, and working with what they learn and know in a way that puts it into that working and long-term memory. So here's what visual note-taking can do. It connects our senses to visual thinking, and I'll be working with some brain work here in a minute to show you exactly how that happens. It activates and connects stored knowledge, and it strengthens memory. It breaks up information into chunks because when we put it onto paper, we're chunking that thinking, and we know chunking is a way for students and us as adults to learn things and retain that. It welcomes linguistic and non-linguistic recording. So for our students who struggle and are at risk, it gives them a tool that they can use and activate their learning that's less of a risk than actually writing out notes like other kinds of note-taking we do, lists, Cornell notes, and things that you may use depending upon your grade level and your students. It allows for student choice, and we know when students have choice and voice, they have ownership in their learning. It develops deeper critical thinking skills. When it's done as analog, it activates different brain parts. And eventually I'll get you into digital sketchnoting with another webinar, and we'll talk about how the brain's activated in some different ways then, not less than, but different ways. And it embraces design and emotional connection. And again, the brain seeks those connections. It activates the learning. And especially for our middle school folks where the dendrites in the brain are getting clipped off, this is a real key thing you can do in those upper grade levels to help keep that brain retaining information that got put in elementary school. So let's take a look for a second. I want you to look at the sketch there. I'm going to cue you in. The writing's in French. So if it's not real clear, unless you're a French student, it doesn't matter. But I want you to think about what is that about. So we're going to take 15 seconds for you to look at it. My hope is that you looked at it and thought, well, that's the Three Little Pigs. And it is. It's the story of the Three Little Pigs. And you didn't have to be able to read it to know it, because you have background knowledge. So we build that. And then you sketched it. It was sketched. And we knew enough about the story to put the sketches together and go, oh, that's the story of the Three Little Pigs. So the visual incoming to our brain is the largest percentage of the information that we get. You can see there's some added color here, and that can create more opportunity for the brain to latch on to the information and begin processing it, like that little bit of brown, a little bit of pink, a little bit of green, and that splash of purple did that for us, and it demands recall. So I want to even go a little bit deeper into the brain. For me, when I started to put medical knowledge together with education, it was pretty exciting, because when I first started teaching, we didn't have that knowledge of how the brain works and how students process information and what's developmentally appropriate. We just did what we were told to do. Now we have that information and we know how things work. So if we look at the parietal lobe, which is the one that's green, that is the sensory headquarters, that's movement headquarters. So when we're sketching and noting, we're activating that part of the brain. The occipital lobe is the vision area, that's the blue part, the lighter blue part. And we know that's where vision and color and shapes, where the brain analyzes that information. The temporal lobe is where, and that's the bottom kind of goldish yellow, that is where language comes into the brain, and the brain begins to sort that language and determine what's to be kept and what's to be thrown out. And then the hippocampus is where that formation of new memories happens, that's also associated with learning and emotions. So that mantra of emotion drives attention and attention drives learning is really true. So when we're doing sketchnoting and students are actively involved, they're also emotionally involved. And that also activates those learning lanes. So you can see with sketchnoting, there's so many parts of the brain that are activated, not just one, but multiple, and that's why it works. I'd like to introduce you to Graham Shaw. Graham walks through on a YouTube TEDx video. He walks through how you can take simple shapes and use those for sketchnoting and retaining information, and he shows you how to do that. So if you go onto YouTube and just put in Graham Shaw, how to draw and remember, have a piece of paper and a pencil with you, or if you work on a tablet, you can use that and work through this with him. You'll be amazed at how simple this learning connection is with simple drawing. You don't have to be an artist, and I'm going to re-emphasize that in just a few minutes. So as we're going through and thinking about how sketchnoting works our brain and what it involves, it gives us a chance to reflect. It gives us the opportunity to take notes in multiple ways that engage the brain. It engages a lot of visual thinking, which is a big percentage of how we learn. There's content creation, so we actually can move through how content gets created and how students can link to that. It's part of graphic organizing. Many of you already use those. That's visible learning. And so mind mapping and chunking it out helps us retain information over time. We can use it in English language arts as well as other content areas. And storytelling doesn't mean necessarily writing stories. It means taking information and linking it together in a way that makes sense. And what I really want to talk about is this process ideation, because this is a real focus of our makers and STEM work, and the components that make it across content and applicable no matter the age of your students or what your content area is. Because remember, ideation is that creative process of generating and developing and communicating new ideas, and where an idea is basically understood as a basic element of thought, that beginning of thought that we then can make visual and concrete, and we can take it into the abstract depending on the age of the student that we're working with and where they are in being able to take things from concrete to abstract. So ideation comprises all stages of the thought cycle, from innovation to development to actualization, and that's a key component of our makerspace and the culture of makerspace thinking. And then again, it's a memory aid. It takes us into those parts of the brain that help build memory, and that's what we're after, having kids retain important information that they then can use over not just our course and our year, but for multiple years to come, that becomes part of that background knowledge that we're trying to build. So back to our goals that I mentioned at the beginning, and again, I'm thinking these are universal, whether you're a kindergarten teacher or you're teaching 12th grade students, that this is what can work with your students. We can actively engage them. We can keep them motivated. They can own their learning. They get some voice and choice. They can ask questions and seek those answers and use sketchnoting as part of that learning process and that investigation and inquiry questioning process. It can be activating those academic skills. And even though we're learning digitally, we know we can work students in these social skill ways through our work on Zoom and forming small groups digitally. If we don't get to see our students actively working in the class,
This conference will now be recorded.
so you can see if we go back to our goals and what we intend for our students, sketchnoting fits these things that I hear from teachers that I know are so global for all of us, that we want our students to be actively engaged, that we want them motivated. Well, when you have students on a tablet sketching with color, or you have them at a table at home or at school working with color and working with engaging their movement and hands, they're actively motivated and engaged. If we want students to own their learning, they're deciding what goes on that paper. If we want them to be seeking answers to questions, those key questions that we want them to be asking and be involved in the process, sketchnoting does that. Then we want them learning in a variety of ways. We want them staying connected. We want them metacognitively thinking about their thinking. Sketchnoting does that. Then we want them to want to come to school, whether school's in a classroom or school's online digitally. We want them to think, oh, I can't wait to see what's going to happen today and how I get to be engaged. We want them to be innovative. We want them to also be connecting to the real world outside of high school, whether they're kindergartners or 12th graders, because this skill is used in the business world. It's used in the medical world. It's used anywhere people are generating ideas and talking and thinking and working together. We want them to be able to be in a developmentally appropriate classroom. So sketchnoting, because it can be used kindergarten through 12th grade, it's developmentally appropriate for any age of student. And then we want our students to be thinking about how they can be designing in the world and to understand that process of design. Because whether you're writing or finishing up a math problem or working in the science classroom or in a lab, all those content areas involve thinking and designing. So today, I'm really glad you were here with me. I'm thinking that if you are going to stay with me, this was part 1. And then part 2, if you're in one of our courses, then we're going to focus on how to sketchnote and actually get to practice together. That's going to be a live thought. So we'll be working together just as if we were in a workshop. So again, I appreciate you being here, and I'm going to kind of look at my teammate, Mike Gorman, and any of my other team members that would like to join in. If you have any questions or comments, I would welcome that at this time.
You know, Chris, as I look at all this, I sit here and I think back to all those days of learning Cornell notes and things like that. Are we saying that that's gone? Or are we saying that that just wasn't right for all kids and that there's other ways to do it too? What are your thoughts on that?
My thoughts are, and I mentioned this in part 2 too, this is something we add to the toolbox. There's nothing wrong with Cornell notes. There's nothing wrong with outline notes. What we can think of is this is another way to actively engage our kids in thinking about what they're learning, whether they're listening to a mini lesson or lecture, or whether they're reading and trying to do a close read, or they're collaborating, a brainstorming. This gives you such latitude in use. So it's not to negate what we've already been doing, but it's to add to the toolbox, because ultimately we want our students successful and we want to be able to include all students. And frankly, you and I both know we had students that couldn't do Cornell notes successfully. They didn't have the language skills to do that, or we were working on building those. Where sketchnoting, and as we get into part 2 and actually doing it and building more language work with it, and you can see on a couple samples, there is a lot of language that can be involved. It's just another way to engage the students and activate the brain in some ways that are different than our other outline note taking might do.
One of the things I wanted to bring Jane in on this one, because I had a question. She's been doing a lot of work with the design element. How do you see this working into some of the things we're talking about on design thinking?
Well, I actually loved it, Chris, when on your final slide there, when you went back to all the goals, you actually had in the top right corner a little model of the engineering design process. And that, again, cuts across all curricula. And yes, it certainly fits with sketchnoting, because you also mentioned brainstorming. And one of the things in brainstorming, sometimes to remember ideas, we might not get everything down, but we might hear something that really activates a thought. And going back to Jefferson's macaroni pasta machine, you know, someone starts sketching their ideas, their thoughts as that brainstorming is going on. So yes, certainly there's a lot of connection.
One of the things I was wondering, because I'll bring Laura in on this too, and then Chris, if you've got some reactions after what we've said. But Laura, you were really active with the Future City projects here in the Fort Wayne area. Does something like this apply? Where do you see this coming into teachers that are working with Future City? Laura, you're on mute right now.
I apologize. One thing that I really love about sketchnoting that I saw in our workshop was how quickly everyone, no matter what subjects they taught, they were able to put that into their classroom. And Future City would be a great example. It's another great cross-curricular project. The brainstorming aspect, as people are talking about the interactions that happen in a city, even what an engineer is, as they're sketching those ideas and helping them really reinforce those thoughts that are behind them. It's very unusual to see people talk about a city without drawing something. And I think that that's true for a lot of science and engineering aspects, is that there's always that drawing component, and it really does help make those connections.
And I think what I really have liked about sketchnoting, what I've heard from teachers, and we've all heard it in some other workshops we've done, is this is something that once you do part 2 and you practice and learn, that you can take to your classroom the very next day. It isn't a big thing that you have to plan out and go, oh my goodness, what am I going to do? And what do I have to do to plan? Though, you know, we do want you to work it into mindful lesson plans, but it's literally something that can be implemented right away. And it can be implemented no matter what grade or content area you're teaching. I've seen sketchnoting done with 4-year-olds at a local school here in Fort Wayne, where they sketched and labeled before they really had command of language, very successfully. And so that's what I love about this. And when you take it into the design process, think about this. When we're thinking about how to problem solve a math problem, we're designing that in our head. When we're creating something in English language arts to put on paper, we're designing. That design process works no matter what our content area is. That's why I put that icon there. You know, we're going to try it, we're going to sketch it, we're going to design it and put it together. So that design process could be the same as the writing process or the mathematical process or the science process. And that's what I love you mentioning Future City. That's an amazing project. And so sketchnoting can fit in anywhere along the line of that project, whether you're brainstorming your initial thinking or you have a part of that city that you're trying to figure out. You can sketchnote it and design it and chunk it and think about it and talk about it. So it's one of those things you can use in multiple ways. And the other thing that I'll just quickly mention that I get into more detail in part 2, it's also a way for you to assess whether you're looking at your students online sketchnoting live, or they share pictures of their sketch notes with you, or you're in a blended situation where you have students in your classroom. As you look at the sketch notes, you gain lots of information, especially if you have them start to label and do other kinds of language things with it. You are taking in data that you then can use to plan other lessons, whether you have to reteach or you have students ready to move forward in their growth and learning. That's the other beautiful thing about it. It can be formal assessment even, but it works really well as informal daily assessment. So look at it that way too, that this is stuff you have to have proof of where your students are, what their growth and learning is. And I really love that about it too. So it's one of those processes that crosses so many lines and fits in so many different ways. And it is really key to the design process. And the other thing too, I mentioned this early on, we're not looking to add anything on your plate. Your plate's full. Your plate's probably overflowing. Teachers' plates are always overflowing. This is something that you can put in your toolbox to give kids in their toolbox and teach them how to do it very simply. And then you have another thing in your repertoire that you can give students choice. So back to Mike's comment, if I have a student that rather take notes as Cornell notes, they can do that. But I have students who are more comfortable sketchnoting, they can do that. And that's where that choice and ownership and motivation and engagement comes in.
Yeah, it's amazing. As we close here, as I watched the whole sketchnoting idea, I started thinking, you know something? I think I was a sketchnoter before they came up with the idea of sketchnoting. And I think all three of us probably felt that a little bit. It's like, yeah, I think we've always done that. What we're doing is we're kind of formalizing it now, and we're backing it with some scientific research, which suddenly we're able to include all of our kids. It's amazing.
And the thing is, and why I bring the brain stuff in, is that when we've always done stuff by happenstance, and some of our best stuff just sort of happens. But whenever we can mindfully and purposefully plan, then we know we're reaching our students. We know we're hitting our standards and curricular targets. We know that we're providing mindful best practice. And that's important. We can't just be willy-nilly. We don't have that kind of time. So when we know mindfully what to do, then our lessons become much more efficient and much more expansive. And that's our goal too as educators.
Well, speaking about mindful, I think we've got a good mindful of this sketchnoting. And I know there's some great things coming our way. We've also got other courses that we're offering on design thinking, on the inquiry process, on at-home science, STEM. we're going to be looking at some things with Future City. All of these things are being offered to you, and they're all free right here from the Makerspace program in Region 8. And so I want to thank everybody for joining us. I want to thank Chris for some wonderful information, and also Laura and Jane for bringing in some of your thoughts and ideas, and also the Schwab Foundation for their generous support of our program. Please join us either later in this series or for one of our other, what I think is just valuable workshops. Also be aware, and you can go onto our site on how you can get PGP points for attending. I want to thank everybody today for being part of this workshop. And until the next one, have a wonderful day.